Hi folks and welcome. For those of you that haven't met me, my name is Tom O'Mahony and I do some work with the Teaching and Learning Unit here in CIT. Hi. We've been running this series in the morning, kind of looking at different aspects around lecturing. This morning we're going to look at the use of questions. Going to look at some different attitudes to questions that maybe I come across in terms of sometimes when people are sitting down at coffee and I'm eavesdropping or part of conversations about teaching and things and the different perspectives or some of the different perspectives around questions. And there's two kind of ideas that we're going to focus on. One is the notion that specific questions when we're in class or when we're talking about lectures, that specific questions that tend to be more useful than generic ones, and I'm going to give some examples of that. And also, I think the way in which we ask questions and that sort of process is really important in terms of engaging students and getting them, to respond or supporting them in terms of their responses. So that's the last two, which is about how we ask them, and the process is the way in which we ask questions. In some ways, is more effective, can be more effective than other ways. I'm going to start off with two kind of topics for you or questions. So the image there I've pulled down, it's not intended to be, I couldn't find a gender balanced one that I liked. So I'm not deliberately trying to suggest one thing or another. Anyhow, sometimes when I listen to people talking, when they're talking about lectures, there's this notion that my job is to lecture and it's students' responsibilities to ask questions. I'd like you to think about your own position on that statement for a minute. And then after, let's say, a minute, I'm going to ask you to have a quick discussion with someone beside you, in pairs or in threes, I don't really mind. And then we'll get some perspectives on that, if that's all right. Everyone understand kind of what I'm asking? That always helps.
That's up to us. That's the Institute of Work.
Yeah. So if you take a minute and just think about your own position first of all, and then, as I said, in pairs you can discuss your position, see whether you've got similar views or whether there are sort of differences in how you view that question or that topic, I guess. I possibly do. Yes. Sorry, Ray, you lost out. I'll email him on to you. So, can we get anyone like to volunteer, first of all, maybe an initial response to that question, or to that statement? It's not really a question.
It all depends.
It all depends. Go for it.
In introductory topic, that's just, it might not be good enough anyway, but in introductory topic, I have to kind of raise interest in something in a first year lecture, and I really have to engage them somehow, and that's how the questions is the main. Me asking them questions is kind of my way to go. Which
Absolutely.
doesn't always work, of course. And that's
Yeah, brilliant. Anyone else have a thought on it? Obviously, I'm going to present my views on it in a little while. Anyone else have something that they'd like to go for it?
No, I would just say, at times, depending on my mood as well, like I might say, all I can do is give you the information, it's up to you to learn it. But if there's something that you don't
Yeah, very nice. I think that notion of talking to your partner and stuff is important. So as I said, I'm going to come back to this and we'll have more discussion on over here or meet. Is this notion students asking questions, which is something that personally I encourage. But often people get very frustrated because the questions are related to topics that they have covered. And it's then about, well, what do we do about those types of questions? Again, I'd like you to think about that for a minute. What's your own position on that? So the quote that's up there, do they ever read your notes? But I just tell them it's in last week's handout. Right? So what would your position be on that? Is that a view that you'd support? Would you be doing something different? The same sort of process. We'll think about it for a minute, and then I'll ask you to have a short discussion, and then we'll invite some contributions. So, in this case, I'm going to invite some people. So, Owen, is it?
Yeah.
What do you think, if you don't mind, or what did you think when you were discussing? It doesn't have to be yours. It's the sort of combination of you.
I would have no problem repeating myself because I understand that students might pick up everything the first time round. Maybe I haven't explained it properly, but I tried to signpost to what we were doing maybe the last day in the lecture last week. And have them maybe remember it or just make them aware that we did cover this already and explain it again.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bridget?
Yeah. We were just discussing it there. It kind of depends on the questions that they're asking.
Sure.
If they're asking you to go over the entire topic in its entirety, then that's very, very different to if they have specific questions.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So it depends really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it raises issues again. So you think about, well, maybe did I cover it well with them? Is it something that I actually need to spend an entire class with, or with the entire group?
Yeah.
It raises it's a signal that something's not.
Yeah, brilliant. In terms of, like, one of the things I would suggest, have suggested in the past, in terms of lectures, it's always important to justify the topics, to provide motivation for why we're doing it. I really believe questions and how we ask them are important in terms of delivering high quality lectures. In terms of, and I'll discuss some of the reasons why I think that. When I request feedback from my students, which I do after each module, I have an open-ended question there, which is, what did you like best about the module? And I look at those responses. There are always responses around questions and the use of questions and how I use them in my courses. So I guess it's not just me that think that it's important. Clearly my students view and respond to this, that it's something that they think is important too. And some of them are to do with the things that we've discussed. The fact that I ask questions of them in one way empowers them to ask questions of me, which is sort of the first topic that we talked about. Is it their responsibility or my responsibility? For me, it's very much my responsibility to ask questions of them. And I'm going to give you another example of why in a minute. I think it's really important. So even if they are to do with topics that we've covered, my view would be that I would be trying always to answer the question. And I do appreciate that if it's very broad, you need to narrow it down, or at least signpost where the notes that they need to be looking at and stuff like that in terms of the sorts of answers. But I would have, I don't think that sort of response, look, it's in last week's handout, look at it and read it, is, it's not something that's likely to encourage that student to ask more questions of me. And that's one of the things that I would like to, to encourage all the time, is that students would feel, I guess, empowered and that they can ask those types of questions of me. So I think they're really important. It's something sometimes I think that's undervalued in terms of delivering lectures. As I said, it would be my perspective that questions are my responsibility. I would see that for a number of reasons. I think partly it's about the type of atmosphere that I want to create in those lectures. If I ask questions of my students about their learning and what they've learned, they perceive it as me caring about their learning. And if we can create that sort of atmosphere in a class, then they're going to be much more responsive, they're going to be more engaged, and things like that. So assuming that or leaving it up to them can change that atmosphere. And I think that's not necessarily a good thing. The more questions I ask, I think the more likely they are to ask questions of me, because they see that as something that's important. If I don't ask them any questions, I think they're much more reluctant to ask me questions because they don't see it as something that's maybe important or valued or relevant. The core reason I think why I would ask students questions is I think to assume that they understand something, even if I ask, do you understand this, is a very dangerous position. And more often than not, students don't fully understand things, even though they think they understand things. I'm going to give you an example in the next slide. So, 3 weeks ago on this semester, I was teaching a topic in my undergraduate course. Now, the topic I'm not going to go into, but it's about how a certain electronic component works. Right? My students would have met this in third year, so it's not their first time encountering this topic. So they encountered the topic in third year. 3 weeks ago, I started doing a revision. They do projects. They need to understand how this works in terms of the projects. So we did a kind of recap on it, focused on the main ideas, give an example of this. I'm looking at them. They seem to be very, they're not hazed over and glazed over and stuff. That they seem to get what I'm talking about. I asked them, do you have any questions? Do you understand what I'm talking about? Everyone says, yeah, it's fine. And then before I leave the topic, I asked this specific question. So the question is to do with taking the idea and applying it to a particular context. Right? And if students understand me, they should be able to apply this to the simple context. It takes about a minute to do this. They do need a calculator. They do need to work out a little simple calculation. So put this up. I say, look, I'd like you to do this individually. Take a minute, work through it. We've worked through an example that's very similar to it already. And then they use their mobile phones to select one of these 5 answers, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And then I say, look, when you're ready, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and all vote now, so they're not copying solutions or anything like that. So it's kind of simultaneous. And when you look at the responses, then we can see clearly that at least 40% of them don't get it. The 2 answers aren't right. Only one of the answers is right. And in fact, in this case, it's number 2 that's right. So 60% of my class have misunderstood that topic. They encountered it in third year. We're after revising it. We've gone through an example. I've asked them, do you understand? Yeah, it's perfect. 60% of them haven't understood the topic properly. And that's the danger with open questions like, do you understand? They may genuinely believe they understand you, and I think all of these students did. Because if they didn't understand me, I think if they didn't understand the topic at all, I'd have got a smattering all over the 5 of them. It would be much more random. And number 1 is a common misunderstanding, is one of the ways in which they misunderstand this topic. So I've deliberately put in this question because I know from past experience this is one of the ways that they make mistakes, or this is one of the common misconceptions about how the thing works, right? So it can, when we're designing these things, it's important to include these things. But the bigger point that I'm trying to make is that students don't often know when they don't understand something. So the only way, in my perspective, that we can assess whether students understand something is by having quite specific questions where we're asking them to apply this concept in some sort of simple context. And by looking at the sorts of responses that we get in multiple ways in which we can do this, this is only one example of how we can do this. But we need to be looking at, taking the concept and applying it to a particular context and looking at the sorts of responses we get. And based on those responses, we can then make a judgment about whether students understand the topic or whether they don't understand the topic, and then whether we are in a position to progress or not. And in this case, we need to go back. Like, you can't go, from my perspective, I can't go forward with 60% of my class misunderstanding a topic. Right? So I need to go back. I need to revisit the example. I need to revisit the concept and focus in on, in this case, because there's one particular misunderstanding, focus in on that and say, look, those of you that chose number one are thinking about it in this way, and that's not the correct way, and then you're highlighting that. And it's really effective then again in terms of addressing those misconceptions that students might have about a particular topic. So in terms of the questions, like if I don't ask students, do you understand, like there's no way at all that I'm going to know whether they understand the topic. But even those very open questions, do you understand, don't necessarily mean that students understand even when they think that they do.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
How do you select the topics that you are going to ask them to apply in that simplified context? And in ballpark figures, what is the kind of time ratio between going through the topic first off and then having to go back, revisit, review, revise it, from, let's say, getting in that case that we see as an example, to get them to the stage whereby I presume is the objective to get 100% of understanding. So to get to that.
Well, no, 100% now is very ambitious, I guess. But certainly, let's say, so in terms of moving on, where am I here? Like if I had 80% of those getting the concept right, I'd probably just spend a minute or two in terms of clarifying it and then move on. In this case, I would have spent about, probably 15 minutes introducing the topic. This takes about 5 minutes to do, and 5 or 7 minutes, focusing on how they've misunderstood it. And then usually, and certainly, and in this case, I'd have followed up then with a slightly more difficult question, but the same concept applies, and have they now got it? And then you see the vast majority of them get it. So,
selecting the topics that you were looking to apply?
I would do it with all of them. So like most of my lectures, I'll talk or lecture for 10 or 15 minutes, and then there'll be an activity, something like this, which is about, have you got what I've talked about? So like I would use this all the time in all my lectures. And again, it's kind of what we were talking about 2 weeks ago, about the notion of content. And like, if we have courses that are full of content, we can't do this. So my argument would always be chop the content. Just get rid of it and focus on understanding. But that takes more time.
Can I just ask
Absolutely.
just a follow-up to that then? In support, if you're covering less content, do you offer them a lot more kind of support material and have expectancies that they read up on that in their own time? Come prepared to task, or is there any of that?
I don't do a lot of it, but I do expect. So instead of them knowing lots of material, I expect that they really understand the stuff that I'm telling them. So my expectation in terms of when I ask them questions, the level of understanding that I get back is quite challenging for them. So the challenge shifts, I think, from having a broad to kind of the notion of depth, and So like all of my exam questions when they are there are about understand, explain. It's not routine sort of formulas and stuff like that.
And when you get around talking the content tools to make space for this, you still trying to do this within the framework of trying to hit 6 learning objectives and...
Yeah. Your learning objectives then often can change too. So like, it depends again, but like you're going to be doing lots more discussions in classes and stuff like that. So it's quite possible that you've different types of learning outcomes. About being able to solve problems effectively and being able to do different things, because that's what you're possibly doing. But but even without that, you can still do it. It's easier to do so this is an example in 4th year. It's very easy to do it there because I don't have follow-on courses.
Yeah.
Okay? I absolutely accept doing this in 1st year is a different challenge because there are implications all the way through, or there may be implications all the way through. So it's not as easy, to take an existing course and say, look, I'm going to knock 30% of the content off of this. So everybody, there's a much different conversation going to happen, and you're going to need a lot more buy-in. And I accept that that's not an easy thing to do.
I think it's quite interesting because I think the controversial topic about dumbing down in education raises its head. When we chop content out, where do we really get the time to teach it the depth? With huge levels, huge class sizes. That is a real challenge. Because if I set a task for a student in class, if they haven't read outside, they are going to struggle a little bit. Then I'll sort of get them to work an exercise, but because they haven't progressed enough, they don't want to use that time constructively within the class task. So I think it's a huge challenge, and I do think we still need to ask the question: are we dumbing down? Because I think that if there is core content, we still need to teach. We need to teach at depth. But we're packing too many people in with too little hours.
Yes, there's certainly all of that, and the other argument is too, if we focus on supporting students to understand for themselves, then content becomes less relevant. They can pick up content easily because there is tons of content there. It's like the issue that many of my students have is learning and how to learn effectively and stuff like that. So I think if we can support them in that role, like there's as much content, there's more content than they're ever going to be able to interact with. So I don't see content as being a huge issue anymore. I think it's more about equipping students to learn that content. So again, for that reason, I wouldn't have any issues with chopping content and focusing on, as you said, I think core concepts are really important. I think we talked about that before, about the notion of, the really important ideas in the discipline, and students need to get those, and that's, I have no argument against that. But I think often we spread ourselves way too thin, and the consequence of that is students don't even get the core ideas. They've just got a notion of them rather than an understanding of them, and I think that's not a great position. So as I said, very broad questions or very detailed questions are not very suitable often. Again, if there's a very detailed, complex topic that I want students to engage with, I'm going to split that up into smaller parts. So like, how do you start the problem? What's the next steps and stuff, and get them to work through those in phases, like we've done here. Often discuss the start of it and how they should start it, and then the next phase, and then we'll discuss the next phase. So we're breaking it up into parts. And the argument for that is if we have very detailed questions, let's say something that takes 10 minutes for a student to do, and you have 30% of the class that can't even start it, that's 10 minutes of that 50 that's completely wasted for them because they don't even know what to do. So by segmenting it, we can, each of the parts takes maybe 2 minutes. Even if they can't start it, look, in 2 minutes' time I'm going to tell you how to start it, and then hopefully you're going to be able to move on so that they don't perceive it as lots of their time being wasted. The sorts of questions, there's a whole variety of questions that we can ask. I find multiple choice questions quite useful because students may not have to work out the answer. The answers are there, and it's a selective process, so it kind of prompts them to the answers or possible answers. And we can also put up kind of common misconceptions. So when I'm thinking about the types of questions that I'm going to be asking my students, I'm also thinking about the ways in which they misunderstand the topic, and those are likely to be answers in terms of the multiple choices. I'm asking students to apply the concept in some way. It could be explaining your own words. It could be compare and contrast. There's a whole variety of different types of questions that we can use, and I use a whole variety of them depending on the topic and what I think is most appropriate. And sometimes it's purely for the purpose of providing variety, so I don't always have multiple choice questions, because then it becomes very repetitive, and students and variety is good. I'm going to skip this. We might come back to this. In terms of asking the questions, the sort of process that I use is very similar to what I've modeled this morning with the two questions that I asked you. Okay, so we start with a specific rather than a general question, and I'm asking students to work with that. The first thing that I'm going to do, or one of the criticisms often in the literature that I've seen about asking questions, is a lecturer asks a question and then immediately answers it, him or herself, or alternatively doesn't give students time to think about the question. Right? So if we're inviting responses, and that was kind of the previous slide, which is the notion of cold calling. So I ask a question, and then immediately I say, Mary, what do you think? And Mary's like, I don't know. It's not very effective, I don't think. Some students take longer to think about a topic. Being smart, a thought process that it takes longer to think about it. And we need to give them time. And if we don't give them time, then I think it's very intimidating for lots of students, particularly those that are more introverted and stuff. It is quite a challenge to offer your view or your opinion in front of all your peers in a classroom. And if we don't support that in some way by giving students time to think about it initially, then the questions is likely to have a detrimental effect, that they are going to be more focused on the question or anticipating the question rather than thinking about the idea that I want them to be thinking about. And so we need to be, I think we need to be careful about how we structure the questions. So giving students time to think, and it's particularly then if we're having the second part where we're asking students to share their perspectives, if we don't give them time to think, first of all, then when we come to the sharing, what you're likely to get is those that think faster are always offering their opinion, and therefore the discussion can be very narrow around one or two ideas, based on one or two individuals that think quite fast. And what you really want is diversity in that kind of conversation. And in order for that to happen, we want everybody to be contributing. Giving students time to think about it is important. So I would always, when I ask a question, I would always pause for a minute, and usually I time it in terms of the phone, to give students time to think about it. And I would be asking them not to contribute answers until, I ask them to start discussion or to start contributing answers. And again, that would be a very kind of standard recommendation. Small group discussions then often follow that, and again, it depends. It doesn't have to. So sometimes I present a question, I give them time to think about it, and sometimes I go straight to here, which is asking them to participate either through, let's say, the mobile phone and that app, or otherwise. Again, the literature I would suggest that small group discussions is really useful in terms of looking at different perspectives, different ways students interact with the topic. There are other reasons too why we might do that. So one of the notions is, again, some students are very find volunteering their own opinions quite intimidating or daunting. And particularly the notion that they might be wrong, and how their peers might view them, and it's often about acceptance by their peers and things like that. If we ask students to discuss it in small groups, pairs or threes, and then I ask them to volunteer, and there is safety in that, or there's an element of safety or reassurance that, look, it's not just me anymore, it's the three of us in this, and if I'm wrong, it's the three of us that's wrong, so it's less damaging, in terms of their own image and self and stuff like that. And so it's that notion of confidence and self-image, and I think that's important too in terms of that kind of class dynamic and particularly in larger groups and things like that, I think is really useful. When I'm doing the small group discussion, if I'm giving them a minute or two, I'll tend to walk around for a variety of purposes. One, to make sure that they're on topic and not talking about other things, and also to kind of listen in and see, are they getting the question that I want them to be discussing? Like, are they misunderstanding me and gone off topic, because they've misunderstood it, as opposed to talking about football or something else that, is obviously off topic. So I'm kind of monitoring this as I do it, insofar as I can. Again, sometimes this is in groups of 60 students and they're tiered, and you can't, it's only the edges you can get to, but at least, you can listen at the edges and you'll have some idea what's going on. And then asking groups to volunteer an answer, or I use these audience response systems. So the Teaching with Technology boys are recommending, I think, Kahoot. I've been using one for a couple of years, which is Poll Everywhere, and I've just chose that before they recommended Kahoot, and I've kind of invested a bit in that in terms of setting up questions, so I'm slower to move off of it. There's a variety of them, and as far as I can see, there's no huge benefits one versus the other. So, I guess from my perspective, questions kind of do two things. I think it's about the sort of teaching and learning environment I want, which I want students to feel like they should be asking questions. So I want to encourage that, and by me asking them questions kind of supports that. It's also that notion that I care about whether they've learned a topic or not, and I think that's really important to them. Have they understood it? I don't think there's any other way I can assess that other than by asking them questions, specific questions in class. It obviously tells me a lot about how ineffective I am as a lecturer, because I have to go back all the time and address stuff that they've misunderstood. And as I said, I'll try and to answer their questions. And some of that's to do with respecting, and then some of it is, well, this student is obviously, at this moment in time, as particular, they're likely to learn it at that instant in time. They may never again be, as focused. And then in terms of a process over here, it's often called, if you look it up, it's called think, pair, share often, is the sort of broad method. Specific questions, giving students time to think. Discussion in small groups, again, that can be optional. It obviously takes more time. So sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't, and it depends about the topic and the complexity of it and whether it's easy or not. If I'm doing that, I'm monitoring it, and then I'm encouraging participation by asking volunteers, or either asking for volunteers, or usually I'm asking groups. So I'll ask individuals in groups, what do you like I did, Owen, what do you think? Bridget, what do you think? And one of the reasons why it's recommended that we do that is that we get as many of the class as possible to engage in it. So if they know they're likely to be asked to volunteer, then they're likely to think more actively about the topic, rather than if I don't ask people, then I'm likely to get the same people, the same groups, or the same individuals volunteering answers all the time, and then the rest of the class will say, well, I don't need to think about it because they'll answer the question anyhow. But there's a difference between doing that after we've given them time to think and time to discuss it, and asking questions and then, immediately asking for volunteers. I think that's a very intimidating process for lots of students. So to make it less intimidating, we're giving them time, they've got discussion, and now I think it's valid to ask individuals because they've had time to think, they've had time to discuss it, and they should have a position at that stage. Thanks so much. At any stage, I know that I never have as much time as I would like for inviting questions and stuff. If you have questions on this, if you have thoughts on it, please feel very free to email me, tomomahany@cit.ie, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. thanks so much. I really appreciate all of you turning up, and I know that you have very busy schedules and stuff, and it's great to see you, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. Thanks a million.